Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Fitzpatrick. I am with Northern 1031 Exchange. Thank you all for joining us. We are going to talk probably about 30 minutes, but I have a couple housekeeping items for you as we go through this. So first, this is going to be recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable being recorded, certainly you can disconnect now and the recording will be sent to you afterwards. But know that once you stay on and if you answer any questions, it's going to be sent out to all the attendees that registered. The other thing is if you could be on mute, that would be appreciated. This is going to be a really open discussion. So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. And I will also be looking through the chat. So if you don't want to put your camera on and your voice on, you can certainly put a question in the chat and we will answer those questions accordingly. So without further ado, like I said, I'm Michelle Fitzpatrick. I am joined here today by Heather Ahrens. She is the managing director at Four Springs Capital. They are a DST sponsor, and I want Heather to do an introduction of who she is, who her company is, and then we're going to get started. Hi, Heather.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. As she said, I work for a DST sponsor, which just means we are a creator of the DST real estate options, and I also am a DST broker, so I peruse the marketplace and look at other sponsors and other DSTs that are out there in the marketplace. So I've been at the company since inception. Four Springs Capital is based in Wall, New Jersey, and it's been we formed it in 2008, but I'm located in Andover, Mass. So if anyone's local and wants to meet one-on-one, I'm happy to do that. You can just get my information from Michelle, and I can sit down and talk to anyone, for a more in-depth conversation.
Thanks, Heather. So why don't we just jump right in and let everybody know, what is a Delaware Statutory Trust?
Sure. Yeah. So a Delaware Statutory Trust is just a tax structure that enables you to buy a large, for an example, institutional quality asset, and you drop it into this tax structure and it becomes syndicated real estate. For example, one of the types of products, the real estate properties we buy are industrial and medical, and they tend to be anywhere from 50 million to 150 million. So for that, a typical investor wouldn't be purchasing that asset by themselves. But because it's dropped into this DST structure, you can take a fractional piece and it still qualifies under the IRS 1031 code. So you could put it as little as 100,000, or you can put, if the size of the property is 50 million, you could buy the whole property. So it really gives you flexibility when you're doing a 1031 and you're looking for a replacement property. What I like to say is, like, for example, if you're selling a CVS for, say, 10 million and you've got something in mind for, a multifamily that you want to purchase for 8 million that qualifies, and you've got this leftover 2 million, that's still, a significant amount of capital that you don't want to pay, taxes on. You could place the 2 million into a DST, and what it does is, how it works is that once the DST is created, you can put your capital in that investment. It pays a monthly income and it's already set in place. So every DST sponsor buys different types of real estate. Some specialize in multifamily properties, some specialize in industrial and medical, which is what our company does. And then other companies do student housing, senior housing. There's all sorts of types of different DSTs. And it's just a matter of really what, your sweet spot is, what you would like, what type of investment that you would like. Because, a lot of times we get clients that want to diversify. So you can put, a little bit, you can break up your capital and put it into different DSTs. And what ends up happening is you put your capital in, they typically have weekly closings. And once you're closed, you start receiving a monthly distribution. And that distribution is typically, right now in the marketplace, when it's like an investment grade type real estate, it's around 5%. And it's predetermined by the lease that's set in place by the tenant. So what we do is we specialize in buying investment grade institutional quality real estate. Think like multi-billion-dollar New York stock exchange type companies like Ford or Amazon. We own the headquarters of Melita Coffee. Anything that's really like a mission critical property to that company, we're going to take a look at and put it into this DST structure. So we're trying to minimize the risk and enable you the ability to, move your investment from, say a multifamily that's has like a lot of maintenance where you're having to run around and deal with tenants and trash and toilets, to this is already set in place and you just get your monthly distribution. And most of our leases are minimally 10 years long. Sometimes they're 15 depending on the tenant, but our programs are usually 5 to 7 years, and then we'll sell that underlying property and then you can perform another 1031 transaction.
So I think a lot of people have heard about a REIT. They've probably heard about it in real estate investment trust. I think DSTs are a little bit less known, commonly known. And I think we get the question as the qualified intermediary, we typically have the questions where people will say, well, can I just invest in a REIT? And we always have to tell them, well, REITs don't qualify for 1031 exchange. They're not actually considered like-kind property because of the way that they are owned. Whereas the DST structure has an ownership structure as tenants in common that allow them to be replacement property for 1031 exchange. But I think people have that misconception that they can go into a REIT. But do you feel like REITs and DSTs are very similar as far as like the type of investment it is, the type of properties that it is? Can you kind of speak to if people know about REITs?
Most sponsors that have REITs, the DST sponsors that actually have REITs as well, they typically buy the same asset class that they're putting into a DST. For example, our company does have a REIT, and when we're looking at a real estate property, we could drop it into our REIT, or we can drop it into a DST structure, just depending on the need of the marketplace. If we're just launched an offering and we came across another property, we might put it in the REIT, or we might wait and then put it out in the marketplace as a DST. The thing about the REIT, there is a two-step process that you can actually invest in a REIT, but you have to go into a DST first.
So from a 1031 exchange.
Yes. So what happens is from a 1031 exchange, you go into a DST. And so if your ultimate goal is to go into a REIT, you would find a DST sponsor that has the ability to do that. And not every DST sponsor has the ability to do that because they don't have a REIT that's formed. Ours is private. We have a private REIT. We're planning on taking it public this year. And so how it works in our program is that you go into a DST and you hold it for 2 years. And that's the government dictating that time frame. And sometime between year 2 and 5, as the sponsor, we will go out and do an independent appraisal with a third party, like CBRE or Cushman & Wakefield, and ask them to do an appraisal on that underlying property. And we could come back to you. So I'll use an example of $1 million. Say you put $1 million into an Amazon DST. In 2 years, it's really not going to probably, change much in valuation. Maybe it'll go up a little more depending on the lease structure, but we can give you that. We'll go back and say, okay, so you put your $1 million in. If you'd like to move that million over into the REIT, you can do a secondary tax deferral, and it's called a 721 UPREIT. And so the government allows you to do it that way. There's 2 ways you can utilize a 721 UPREIT. One is if you had a property that fit the REIT's needs. So say you owned a Amazon building, you can do a direct UPREIT instead of going through the DST program. Or if you don't have a property that would qualify for what the REIT wants to acquire, you could sell your property, go into the DST, hold it for 2 years. And sometimes between year 2 and 5, the sponsor will give you the option to move your investment over into the REIT. And so say you're like, you know what, your REIT hasn't been, publicly traded for as long as I want to see. I want to see a longer track record. you can wait till the end of the program. So in year 5 to 7, you'll get a second crack at that ability to move it over into the REIT. This is how our program works. Every sponsor is a little bit different. Some sponsors are mandatory UPREIT, which I try to stay away from those because really you don't know what's going to happen in the next like 5 to 7 years with the business cycle and the real estate market. But you can do that. And why people do that is because now your investment is not just in that one particular property of that DST. It's now diversified amongst the entire portfolio in the REIT. So think of like a REIT, like a mutual fund of the same type of investment grade commercial properties. And so you're going to get diversification. But what it really enables the ability to do is you get liquidity. So with the DSTs, the downside to them are the lack of liquidity. You're in the program for 5 to 7 years long. If you go into the UPREIT, you have to hold it for one more year. That's the government dictating that. So you're really in it minimally for 3 years. And then after that, you have the ability to sell it. So say you do a transaction of the size of 5 million and every year you want to take out 250 or 500,000, you convert those tax protected shares and you exchange them for common shares and you sell them in the open market. And the only reason you would do that is for liquidity. And then you just pay the tax on the pro rata amount that you have sold. So it's a great way to piecemeal the tax burden out so that you're not having to worry about every 5 to 7 years rotating into another DST or, trying to find another like kind exchange. Because you can go from, if you do a DST and you're like, you know what, I didn't like the rigidity of it where I couldn't have, the liquidity when I wanted it, you can go back into another like kind exchange. You can go into multifamily or, you don't have to. Go ahead.
Can I stop you and interrupt for just 1 second and break that down a little bit? Because that's a really important piece. If somebody decides that they're going to exchange out of a bricks and mortar property, something that they've self-managed, they go into a DST. Now, at the end of the DST, let's say they've gotten to their 5 years, the sponsor decides to sell the property. Tell us the options that the client has at year 5 after the DST is now sold and they are faced with what?
Yeah, so we would know like what happens is we would, tell the client, we give them enough notice that that underlying property is being sold. So you're going to have the ability to either you can do another 1031 into another like kind exchange. So you could buy any kind of property that qualifies under the 1031 code. B, you could do another DST, and you could just roll it into another DST. Or C, with us, you're going to have the ability to UPREIT. And the UPREIT, it does work for a lot of investors that are on their back nine in the sense that it's really good estate planning because now you have shares and say you have a couple of heirs and they have different financial needs. Now, upon your passing, they get the step up in basis like any other real estate transaction, whether you're in the DST or the UPREIT or regular real estate. But now they have shares that you have designated in your estate planning of, what heir gets what. And one heir can virtually the next day sell and avoid paying any tax. And, another heir can, just keep collecting the monthly income, say they don't need, liquidity, but they still get the step up in basis. So now they have a new basis. So anything, if the REIT goes higher, they've got this new threshold. So it does give you like some more flexibility in that regard so that your heirs are they're not fighting over your assets. Because if you have like, say for a FedEx as an example, and you pass on, yes, they get the step up, but they're actually arguing of should we sell the FedEx building or should we sell the apartment building? Like this, they're independent of each other. They have their own amount of operating partnership units in that REIT, and they can act independent of each other.
That's, I think that that's a really good option for people to have. But know that once you go into the UPREIT, there's no 1031 exchange option from there. So if you go from the DST into the UPREIT, you are now in the REIT, and that is coming out of a REIT is not exchangeable anymore.
Right. Once you sell the underlying shares, then you have to pay the tax, because these are all tax deferrals, not tax avoidance. I wish that it was, because then everybody would do it. But they're only tax deferrals. The only time you get to avoid the taxes, unfortunately, upon the death.
Yep. So let's talk about that just a little bit. When we talk about the 1031 exchange as a tax deferral, that means that you are taking your tax basis from your relinquished property, the one that you're selling. So let's just use a real life example. You bought it for $100,000. You're selling it for $1 million. You now have a $900,000 gain in that property. Your tax basis, if all things were equal and you decide that you want to purchase a replacement property, be it a DST, be it a bricks and mortar property, it doesn't matter. You buy $1 million worth of replacement property. Your tax basis in that new property is $1 million. So you are always going to be taxed, even if you sell that replacement property, you're going to be taxed on what you would have been taxed on had you not done an exchange. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And Heather's alluded to this a couple times, and we have a kind of a crude saying in the business that says swap until you drop. It just essentially means exchange until you die, if you can, because then what it does is it gives you the stepped up in tax basis. It gives your heirs the stepped up in tax basis. So it's a good estate planning tool from that purpose. If you don't need the liquidity and you want to continue exchanging in DSTs or passive income, and you're reaping kind of all the benefits, you're maintaining your equity position, you're earning your cash flow, exchanging until you pass away and your heirs inheriting that stepped up in tax basis is a good strategy. Do you think people utilize that a lot, Heath?
Yeah, I do. I definitely think that the other really good aspect to the DST is that you're accessing institutional real estate that you wouldn't normally be able to access. And you're also, the risks on these are A, the lack of liquidity, but B, is if these are the ones that our company does are all corporate tenants, and they're all typically, they've got to hit a certain like threshold. They either have to be investment grade or credit worthy. So as long as the parent company doesn't go bankrupt, you still will get that monthly distribution. So if say they open an Amazon in North Andover and they engage in a 10-year lease and they decide, you know what, this isn't the location we really want, and they vacate, they're still on the hook for that 10-year lease. If they went bankrupt, then this is a DST is better than a bond in the sense you still own a piece of the dirt, and that's why it qualifies under the 1031 code. So that's where having a good DST sponsor comes into play, because you want to make sure that they're good stewards and they're not just going to, walk away from the property, that they'll be able to re-tenant it. And so really what you're paying for is the expertise of the team to, assess the real estate, not only the corporate tenant, but the actual location. Is it mission critical to the business? Is it in the right demographics, the right geography? And you don't necessarily have to do just one DST. You can diversify across several. It just depends on what is available in the marketplace. And how they typically operate is, as soon as a DST gets launched, it's first come, first serve. There is wiggle room where, if you've got an exchange, like say it's in 2 months and we just launched a brand new offering, you can reserve your place there so that that you have something. It's also great to utilize as a backup. So say you own a multifamily and you end up wanting to buy another one, and you're in that 45-day period. It's good to utilize a DST as a backup, because then after the 45th day, say you discover something during your due diligence of that underlying property that it was unforeseen. You didn't know that was going to happen, and you decide that you're going to pass on it. If you don't have anything as a backup, then unfortunately you're going to have to pay the tax. So a DST can be, very suitable and utilized well in that situation as well.
So let's talk about it, I guess, 2 different ways. So I think we talked about it as a DST as a backup. So if you are thinking that you're going to buy bricks and mortar property, you get to your 45th day, or you get past your 45th day, you identified a couple bricks and mortar property, you identified a DST, and the bricks and mortar property that you wanted to purchase burns down. Something happens to it, the inspection doesn't come back. You have that DST as a backup. How about, And I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what about if you had leftovers? So what we call boot. So if
Mhm.
you are selling for $1 million, you find a dream property for 800,000, can you use a DST for that remaining portion, that $200,000 cash boot?
Yeah, that's typically what it's utilized for, unless, you've got an investor who really just wants truly passive income. The beauty of this is you're never going to get a phone call because these are all triple net leases. So all the expenses and the taxes and everything's on the tenant. So that's why it's so imperative that, the corporate tenant has a great rating. And so really you're just getting your monthly income. It gets paid on or about the 15th of the month, and then you get a tax document at the end of January for your accountant. It's called a grantor's trust letter, similar to a K-1 or 1099. But you can, typically most sponsors have minimum. Sometimes they're 100, sometimes they're 250. Like if it's something with Four Springs, I can get it, the minimum waive. So even if it's like, I had a call yesterday, somebody had a leftover boot for 43,000. They just didn't want to pay 40% of that to the government. And he was like, can you squeeze me in? I was like, sure, no problem. So, it doesn't really matter the size of it. It's just more the fact that you're saving depending on your basis. And that's why it's always good to run all your numbers by your tax advisor to see what what you're going to end up paying. Sometimes, clients decide, what, I will pay, or sometimes it's better just to put that leftover boot into a DST and get that monthly income.
So what I heard was that there are some companies that have minimum buy-ins, $100,000, $250,000, but from
Yeah.
your standpoint, there's not necessarily a minimum buy-in. We would definitely be able to get in if there was $50,000 left over.
Right. What you get as a DST investor, if you're looking at it, you'll get a document, their marketing material. It's called a private placement memorandum. And right on the front, they'll show a minimum, or the first couple of pages. So that's what, like on ours, it says a minimum too, but it can get waived. And a lot of sponsors will waive their minimum, if it's, it depends. Some are very strict with it, some are not. So it just really depends on, what the offering is and when they've launched it. If it's at the tail end, they kind of just want the bigger orders to come in to close it out.
Okay. So can we talk a little bit about maybe who can invest in a DST as far as like, do you have to be qualified? So you're a licensed financial advisor.
Right.
And the DSTs are regulated through the Security and Exchange Commission. So only licensed financial advisors can
Right.
sell and market these. So is there a qualification for an investor to be able to get into a DST?
Yeah, so the mandate for that is that you have to have $1 million of net worth. Most people selling real estate, especially in New England, hit that threshold just alone by the property sale, but sometimes they don't. And they do, the reason they do that, they put that $1 million, it's called an accredited investor, is because of the lack of liquidity. They don't want, like, if you're selling something for 200,000 and you're making 30,000 a year, like, this is not really probably prudent. So they want to make sure that you can withstand not having access to that capital for 5 to 7 years. You're going to get the income on it, but just that they want to make sure that you have the wherewithal to sustain that.
So I think we touched a lot on kind of the benefits of DSTs, and you just touched on maybe the I don't want to say the negative side of DSTs, but some of the cons to the DSTs, which is the illiquidity. Is there anything else? And I know you touched on a little bit about if a tenant goes bankrupt, that might be a risk that's associated. Can you think of any other reasons why people maybe would be concerned about a DST other than the illiquidity and the lack of management?
Yeah, I mean, I think all DSTs aren't created equal. It's like all mutual funds, aren't created equal. It's really like you got to dig underneath the hood and make sure that the sponsor really knows what they're doing. The other risk that you can have, a lot of the DSTs have, they're either structured where they're all cash, meaning the property has no debt on the actual property, or they're built with non-recourse debt. And the reason being is that when a lot of 1031 investors, when they're selling their property, they've got a mortgage that they have to replace. So the government doesn't care how you financed a property. They just, if you sold for 2 million and you've got $1 million of debt, you still need to replace that $2 million worth of real estate. So that means at the closing, you're paying off that loan, but you're only left with $1 million of equity. But you have to find something worth 2 million to satisfy the 1031. So that's where a DST can come in very handy, where they've got, like for example, our offerings are either all cash, meaning no debt, or roughly around 50%. So it's nice because like a lot of times, especially in this market, it's sometimes tough to get financing. So in this way, it's already built in. But that has risks as well because, if you bought a DST 5 or 6 years ago and and it's coming due, how you were able to, your interest rate was, 2.5%, 3%. There's interest rate risk. So if the interest rates go up, like we're in this climate now, it can diminish the sale price. So, and that is a risk that, people should be, if you're very conservative, if you're coming out with a property that's all cash, I wouldn't go into a DST that has debt. There are advantages to doing that though. Like if you have depreciated your asset, if you say you sold something for 2 million and you have no debt and you went into a DST that has 50% leverage, you're now what they call levering up, and you get a new depreciation schedule on the extra 2 million that you're technically taking. But when you sell that property in year 5 to 7, you're going to have to replace, approximately $4 million of value. So that is something that, I can walk each one through in your scenario, and I make sure that you know all the risks, because that, for some people that's great because you get a new depreciation schedule and you can offset that with the income that you're receiving. So some people like it, and some people are completely debt averse, and then you don't need to. So you could just go into an all cash DST. So I know I'm probably digging too far into the weeds, but like I can do one-on-one, if anyone has any questions regarding that.
Yeah, and I think that's I think the debt component, you just kind of put a lot of information out there, but I think from a debt perspective, people who have mortgages in their property, maybe they've owned their property for a long time, they've done a cash out refi, now they have debt on their property, going into a DST that allows them to get that. Again, it's non-recourse debt, so they're not going out and getting a mortgage. It's built into the sponsor's package. It's built into the offering. So you're not qualifying for a loan. You're not going out and taking out a mortgage, but it does satisfy the 1031 exchange requirements. And I think that that's a really good option, especially those people that have done cash out refis, have already kind of reaped that non-taxable cash benefit from their property and can still take advantage of the 1031 exchange in a passive property like a DST. So
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that that's the biggest. The biggest risk to a DST is the sponsor, what type of properties they're buying, what kind of tenant it is, and the location. So you just want to make sure, like assessing any real estate, you want to do your due diligence and make sure that the team that you're working with, has a really good track record and buys quality properties, and then it's really, I have so many investors that are like, oh, I should have done this 10 years ago because it's, I don't have to deal with tenants and, my taxes going up, and everything's already set in place. So it can be utilized very seamlessly. And, then there's other DSTs that, can be risky. So it's just a matter of, what kind of DST you put yourself into.
Do you have a typical client? Do you see somebody like with a typical demographic, or is it anybody from young to old, from different locations? Do you have a typical client?
Not really. I mean,
No.
a lot of my clients are, really were actively managing their portfolio and kind of like gearing up for retirement. And this, it works really well for them because their heirs don't really want to be involved with the family real estate business. And this works for them because they know it's professionally managed. It's institutional grade real estate, and they have a peace of mind that they've worked their whole entire life building this portfolio, and they're going to leave it in good hands for their heirs. But no, I mean, it runs the gamut. I have, every kind of walk of life that, if you own real estate and you want to just defer it, this is, a good utilization for it.
So Heather, I think you touched on this, but I'm going to ask anyway, just so we can highlight it. But can an investor, once they're in the DST, and let's say they're going into a DST, can they what if year one, can they liquidate? Is there a secondary market that they can sell? Is there, and I think I know you touched on it, so I just want to make sure that we highlight this, that
I would say no, but there is a company that does it, but it's not worth doing because you might as well have paid the tax. By the time it's literally, they end up taking like 30%. So it's not really worth doing. It's not a viable option. So I always try to make sure that investors really understand the lack of liquidity, that it's 5 to 7 years, and you'll see like in those private placement memorandums there's a cash flow statement, and because the lease is already set in place, you know exactly what you're getting. So the type of properties we're buying, you typically have like rent bumps, so that way the distribution may start at say 5%, but it grows over time, say to 5.25 or 5. One we have right now goes to 586 over the life of the program. So it just depends on the tenant and the terms of that. So
okay. So somebody asked that's online that she said, you mentioned a tenancy in common early on. Are there any liability implications as an owner rather than investor in the DST?
No. No, the DST, like it's really the trust manager, and there's no liability on the down at the investor level.
Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions that you have? I still have a couple questions for Heather to kind of dig into some of the things that we briefed over, but are there any questions that you have? Feel free, again, put them in the chat or just unmute yourself and certainly ask those questions as you need. So DSTs satisfy the 1031 exchange requirements. And we talked about that from it satisfies the ownership component, but it also satisfies the replacement value of the property being both whether there's debt or no debt on the property. So I think we talked about that. Can you talk a little bit about the typical returns? I know you said it early on, it was like 4%, 5%, but can you talk about the typical returns, what it would look like with a debt property versus a cash property, what it looks like annualized, and then maybe what they might expect when the DST sells?
Yeah, so typically right now, anything with like investment grade tenants, it's hovering around a little bit more than 5%. And it grows because most of these leases have rent bumps, meaning they escalate every year or every other year. What we strive to do is in that 5 to 7 year window is when we sell the asset to give you 100% of your principal back, and then typically it's usually getting an additional 7 to 11% on top of that. And then you can do another 1030, like when you sell that DST, you're allowed to, use all that capital and do another, you can go back into it. Somebody's, I guess, asking if you can go back into a brick and mortar, which you absolutely can. As long as it qualifies under the 1031 code and it's investment property, then yes. But yeah, that's typically roughly what it is right now. And whether it's cash or a debt offering, it's negligible. Maybe it just depends on the tenant. So it's not, maybe one's 505, one's 503. So it's not like that you see this huge disparity where, a debt deal is paying 6.5% and an all cash is 5%. Right now, it's right around the same.
Okay. So what exactly does that 5% number mean? Is that annual income from the DST?
Yes. So for example, if you put in $1 million, you get $50,000 annual income. divide that by 12, and that's the monthly distribution that you'll receive.
So let's talk about that for just a second. If somebody goes into a debt deal, they put $1 million of equity into the property for a $2 million 1031 exchange. So they have $1 million of debt and $1 million of equity. The equity is the only thing that's obviously receiving the income.
Right.
So
Yep.
even though you have a $2 million purchase price,
Yep.
it's $1 million on the equity.
Absolutely. Yep.
So we have another question. What are the upfront fees associated with investing in a DST as a percentage? If you have $1 million to invest, how much will actually be deployed, and what is attributed to fees that's not considered as my equity injection?
Yeah. So all the DST sponsors are different. We are actually trying to be at the low end of that. And the actual distribution rates that I'm quoting have already taken into account the fee. They're already baked into the offering. But typically, some DST sponsors charge 14 to 16%. Ours are about 8 to 9. So that's already taken out of the distribution rate. So if you were to buy that asset, instead of getting 5%, you would have gotten like 5-10. So that there's no annual fees. There's not like if you go through it, sometimes a typical financial broker will charge an annual fee. We don't do any of that. And then on the back end is when you sell the property, you have to get 100% of your principal back, and then any profit we get a 2% of the profit. So we are incentivized to make sure that there's a profit for the investors.
So the $1 million investment will be redeployed as $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was a good question. Anybody else have any other questions for Heather? I'm certainly happy to answer any questions about the 1031 process. I can pop Heather's information up on the screen as well. I did have a slideshow, but we kind of just talked it through. Anyway, can everybody see my screen and see Heather's information on there?
Yeah, like I said before, I am located in Andover, Mass. So I'm happy to meet with anyone either on the phone or for coffee, and walk them through everything if anyone has, because it's a lot to take in. And this is what I do daily, is just walk people through, because most people don't know what a DST is. So no question is off the table, and I can answer it. I also like to talk to investors, accountants, because a lot of times the accountant might be like, yeah, I've heard of it, but I don't really understand it. And then I have them call me and, ask me a zillion questions. And then once they kind of vet it, they actually like it. So. Yeah, and then somebody's asking about the 3 property rule. Yes, the DST could be used as one of the 3 properties. So if the DST and it has, sometimes they'll have 1 property in that DST, sometimes they'll have 2, sometimes they can have 10. So if they've already go past say you've identified 1 property, and like we have a DST right now that has 2 properties, and you want to identify something else, you would go to the 200% rule, which means you can invest, like say you're selling something for 10 million, you can identify as many properties you want, as long as you don't go above the 200% of the relinquished value, meaning $20 million in value. You could identify 70 properties as long as you don't go over that fair market, 200% of the fair market value.
Yeah, so I just popped up the rules on the screen so you can see them. You do have to choose between one of the rules, whether it's the 3 property rule, the 200% rule, or the infrequently used 95% rule.
Right.
So, but yes. So
yeah,
if there are
and if anyone
properties,
has any questions on that, obviously Michelle is, you can go through that with Michelle or myself. I'm happy to walk you through it. Just that's why having a qualified intermediary that checks everything and makes sure that you're identifying correctly is super helpful before you actually identify everything.
Yep. Are there any other questions? You guys had great questions, so happy to hang on for a little bit longer. I know we typically earmark around 45 minutes for these webinars. So we have about 4 minutes left. So fire away if you have anything else. Feel free to unmute if you have any questions that you want to just kind of talk through that might be easier. But we'll stay on for a little while longer. Heather, anything else that you can think of that we might hadn't talked about? I feel like we kind of hit it all.
No, I mean, I think that, for investors, I am not a QI. Michelle is the QI. The difference, Michelle is, where you actually place your funds. And she's probably the first person you need to talk to before you talk to me. But it's always good to, like I say, you're planning on selling a property in the next year or so. It's always good to just, start talking to me to find out, what's in the marketplace. And I always like to, keep a pulse on everything. And say you're like selling something next week and you're like, wait, I want to use this as a backup. Feel free to reach out to me and I can give you what's, currently on the market and, kind of walk you through a typical, what we have, that would actually qualify as a replacement for you.
So Northern Bank owns Northern 1031 Exchange. That's the qualified intermediary service. So that's what that's what I do. That's who I work for. And Heather is a separate company called Four Springs Capital. So we are separate, but we have a lot of same customers. Heather's been very good about working with our customers the way we do. We feel like we spend a lot of time with our customers, walking them through the exchange process. A lot of times this is their one and done. This is their only exchange that they may do. And we pride ourselves in the time that we take and the guidance that we give. And Heather provides that same level of service and guidance and expertise that our clients appreciate. So we appreciate having Heather as a resource for us. Any other questions? We got 2 minutes. Nothing else?
I do have one more question. I unmuted because it's easier to say it than type it.
Perfect.
But, so you alluded to heirs, especially if you did the UPREIT, but if you've got the DST, what do you do with that in your estate planning? Is that sort of where everybody's kind of stuck together still in a DST?
Yeah, so on the DST, upon your passing, we would re-register it. They would receive the income, but they would basically be in it for the same 5 to 7 years until we sell the underlying asset. Because it is real estate, it's not like we can just sell a piece of it. So that's why. So like if you have the DST, they get the step up in basis like like an UPREIT or any other real estate transaction, but they do have to wait till the sponsor actually sells the underlying property. And then they can, do what they want with it then.
Separately, or do they have to?
Yes, we have an internal operations team. This happens all the time, unfortunately. So they would, the heirs would produce the documents and it just gets re-registered. So say you had 4 heirs and you were collecting $5,000 or $4,000 of income every month. It can get split between those 4 heirs. So however your estate planning states will ask for certain documents and then they will each get their own pro rata amount.
But then when that DST reaches the end of its life, if one of them doesn't want to continue and just wants to pay the gain on their share, can that happen? The other 3 stay?
Okay. Yep, absolutely.
But because of the stepped up in basis, they'll have hopefully a very small gain.
Hopefully they have a small gain,
a substantial gain.
Even if it was 7 or 11%, above like where that base that time that you're passed away, it's small relatively compared to what obviously they're avoiding from the beginning, from your original basis.
Right. I was just looking to wonder about the flexibility, for them to make different choices if.
Yeah, I mean, they don't really get flexibility unless they're in the UPREIT option, just because the nature, because it's real estate and because you're in a syndicated piece. It's not like you can just sell that piece. You're just not allowed to do that.
But at the end, they could all split that 4 different ways.
Yes.
So at the end of the DST, they can split their 4 different ways. 2 people can go buy a property. 1 person can go into a DST, and 1 person can buy a boat, cash out and buy a boat. So I think they have the flexibility at the end of the DST.
That was my question.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Good. Good question, Robin. Anything else? You guys have been wonderful today. The questions were great. Heather is so knowledgeable, so we really appreciate having Heather on and bringing some light to DSTs and our exchange clients and our realtors and our attorney friends. So thank you all. Once we leave the meeting, we are going to send the recording to you, so feel free to pass that along and look for our webinar next month. I forget exactly which day it is. It's May 18th-ish, somewhere around there. So we will hopefully see you guys next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
Michelle.
Robin.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.